Um, Hello and welcome to this video. I'm going to be talking about avoiding the twin traps of psychological and spiritual bypassing in Enneagram theory and practice. And this is based on the fact that I was asked to reflect on and make a response to an essay by someone called Karl Marsack with the title Psychological and Spiritual Bypassing in Enneagram Theory and Practice. I can give you the link to the actual original essay, but this is to acknowledge that my thoughts and reflections and my response to it is based on what he wrote. I'm assuming that you have had some familiarity with the Enneagram, those of you who are watching. If not, there are plenty of other places where you can find out more about it. Now, Marsack expresses his thesis in the following words. If the Enneagram is first and foremost a diagram and system for psychological healing, growth, and integration, then the primary concern is to understand and avoid what has become known in transpersonal psychology as spiritual bypassing. And later he writes, and if the Enneagram was originally designed by someone somewhere as a primary tool for advanced and profound spiritual development, then one of the things that blocks this conscious agenda is the pervasive and deleterious tendency to engage in what some are now calling psychological bypassing. Whereas much has now been written about spiritual bypassing and its dangers are now well understood by Enneagram teachers, little has been written about psychological bypassing, which is much harder to detect. And so his thesis is that when we engage in either form of bypassing, we perpetuate a counterproductive split between the psychological and spiritual realms, and in the process may hinder our ability to become integrated and wise. To explain what spiritual and psychological bypassing are and how to avoid falling into one or other of these two traps, it will be helpful to refer to Roberto Assagioli's well-known egg diagram of the human psyche. Assagioli was a contemporary of Jung, and with Jung was the forefather of transpersonal psychology. But he went beyond that to develop what was later called psychosynthesis, which encapsulates the best and most useful aspects of the previous frameworks and then goes beyond them. Now, all the automatic biological functions of the body, including instincts such as the self-preservation, sexual and social instincts, as well as all the memories, emotions, and thoughts that we find unacceptable and therefore repress, are in the lower unconscious. Uncovering and exploring this is the focus of Freudian psychoanalysis. In the middle unconscious is our various experiences are assimilated, our thoughts and imaginations are elaborated and developed in a kind of psychological gestation before they are birthed into our conscious mind. And this is the focus of behavioral psychology, or I'm simplifying the categorization a little bit, I'm afraid. All the latent higher psychic functions and spiritual energies are present in the higher unconscious, and this is the source of our higher intuitions and inspirations and of higher feelings such as altruistic love. Accessing this realm and making it conscious through various kinds of spiritual practice leads to feelings of illumination and ecstasy. Transpersonal psychotherapy aims to help people become conscious of this realm and to integrate its content into the personality. At the center of the egg is the field of consciousness, which is the incessant flow of sensations, images, thoughts, feelings, desires, and impulses of which we are directly aware and which we can observe, analyze, and judge. But in the center of the field of consciousness is the conscious self, or I. That is the point of pure self-awareness, and it is often confused with the field of consciousness, but in fact it's quite different from it, as can be ascertained by the use of careful self-observation. So the changing contents of our consciousness, which the sensations, thoughts, and feelings, etc., are one thing, while the I, the self that observes this, the center of our consciousness, is another. But most people, and even many well-educated people, do not take the trouble to observe themselves and to discriminate between the two, and so they drift along on the surface of their stream of consciousness, assuming that this is who they are. Gurdjieff, who introduced the Enneagram to the modern world, described people like this as man. He was speaking in a time before we got fussy about this particular term for humanity. Man in quotation marks, an automaton. The higher self, which is not to be confused with Freud's superego, is the true self. Assagioli placed it at the top of the egg, sometimes called soul, to show that it is unaffected by the flow of the mind stream or bodily conditions. However, the higher self isn't a thing that exists separately from every other part of the psyche. In fact, the whole psyche is embedded within the higher self and arises from it, including all the lower stuff, and hence I've placed it as a zone around the egg. An individual person, represented by this egg, is surrounded by the field of the collective unconscious. The boundary between an individual and the collective unconscious is like the porous membrane around a cell, which permits a constant and active interchange with the whole body to which the cell belongs. Processes of psychological osmosis are going on all the time, both with other human beings and with the general psychic environment. Spiritual bypassing happens when we focus too much on accessing, or at least trying to access, the higher unconscious and neglect paying attention to the lower unconscious. So the body and its associated needs and desires are often regarded as impure, or at least as an obstacle to spiritual attainment. Spiritual bypassing, therefore, is the tendency to engage in spiritual practices that give rise to altered states of mind, to which we can become addicted because they make us feel good. But because these altered states are temporary, they do not in and of themselves help us develop the more permanent traits of an awake and enlightened human being who is fully integrated in all aspects of his or her life. If we avoid attending to the contents of the lower unconscious, we may, for example, project them onto others, as Enneagram Type 6 does, split off from them using the schizoid defense of Enneagram Type 5, or deny that we are weak and vulnerable, like an Enneagram Type 8, or in other ways, as seen in the defense mechanisms of the other Enneagram types. Psychological bypassing, on the other hand, is to focus too much energy and attention on the lower unconscious and to neglect paying attention to our higher unconscious. In the process of digging into the ways we have been wounded in the past, it looks as if we are dealing with them seriously. But the danger is we can become so narcissistically preoccupied with our own psychological wounds and processing them that we run the risk of short-circuiting and sacrificing our ability to understand and participate in our own spiritual evolution, which was the original purpose of the Enneagram. Now, Marsac believes that the best way to make sure the Enneagram fulfills its purpose is to apply the methodology of Roberto Assagioli's psychosynthesis framework and focus on the higher unconscious at least as much as the lower unconscious, with the understanding that both can be dynamically repressed. In other words, we sometimes are not able to accept the gold dust that we really are, the fact that we are divine beings in essence, or at least potentially. However, the Enneagram symbol, as Gurdjieff originally taught it, was not a map of human personalities, but a tool for understanding three fundamental and universal laws that govern the way the universe, both in its physical and spiritual dimensions, is formed, evolves, and develops. These are the law of one, represented by the circle, the law of three, represented by the triangle, and the law of seven, represented by the hexad of lines that crisscross the circle. And this is known as the Process Enneagram. Now, the law of one states that there is an underlying unity and interconnectedness to all that exists, both seen and unseen, even when this does not appear to be the case. Now, cutting-edge science, cosmology, physicists are beginning to recognize that this is actually that this is true. Although it was known to the ancient wisdom traditions centuries, if not millennia ago. The law of three governs how something new comes into being, so new phenomena, new worlds, new outcomes, new possibilities. For anything new to arise, three independent and equal forces are involved. An active, moving or affirming force, a passive, resisting or denying force, and a reconciling or neutralizing force. The interweaving of the three produce a fourth in a new dimension. So here are some of the examples of how we can how we see this in the natural world. There's the sailing ship, the moving force, the active force being the wind, the resistant force being the keel of the ship and the sail, and the neutralizing or reconciling force being the skill of the helmsman. I won't go through all of these particular illustrations here, but one, for example, even the birth of a human being, the formation of an embryo is the result of an active force, the sperm, the negative or the passive force of the egg, and then the lovemaking of the couple that are forming the baby, and being the reconciling force that brings them together. Now, in the unawakened human automaton, as Gurdjieff called us, the conscious self is passive, and the ego personality, driven by the stuff in the shadow or unconscious mind, is active. However, in trying to trying to change by ego effort is not an effective third force, especially if we defend the ego by bypassing the essential work of making conscious and integrating the repressed contents of the lower and upper unconscious. And this is only made worse by religion and its laws. St. Paul expressed it in these well-known words: "With my mind I serve God's law," i.e. we have a desire to do what is right, "but with my unspiritual nature or ego personality, I serve the law of sin." That is, the ego passions. It's a bit unfortunate that in the original Greek he chose the term flesh to refer to what today we would call the ego. However, when we relax the ego, the active and passive roles are reversed. So our conscious self becomes the active force, and the ego personality, the passive or resistant force, is still there. But relaxing the ego allows the mysterious divine force that in the Christian tradition is called grace to function as a third reconciling force that brings the conscious self and the ego personality to come into a kind of creative relationship, so that the new being or divine being or higher self, the new creation as St. Paul calls it, begins to manifest. Now, the law of seven, represented by the hexad of crisscrossing lines, is about the fact that things have to happen in a particular order for there to be progress. There are no shortcuts in life. Creation, if you like, is ordered in a certain way, which is, I believe, what the first creation myth in the book of Genesis is all about. Now, Gurdjieff called the law of three, the law of seven, the law of octaves, because it relates to the mathematics of a musical octave. This goes back to Pythagoras, who believed that numbers could be used to elicit mystical truths and as a basis for contemplation, because they are an archetypical kind of language that links us to the divine mind. You just have to know how to read them. And I'm not going to go into the details of the mathematics to explain why it works out this way, and there's a particular order in that it goes from 1 to 1, 4, 2, 8, 5, 7. Now, the Personality Enneagram can be considered to represent 9 points of view in space. in that the passions and fixations of each personality are based on a particular but unconscious and distorted or incomplete perspective on reality. Thus, the way we each respond to life, depicted in my diagram here by the elephant, will differ. The process on Enneagram, on the other hand, represents 9 stages of growth in time and is applicable to all kinds of process, including the growth and development of corporate bodies, and not just to that of the personal and growth and in transformation. So progress around the circle happens according to the law of 3 and the law of 7. But to explain these in detail and how to apply them will take another whole session. Each person, no matter where they sit on the personality Enneagram, needs to grow into a fully integrated human being. And the way each personality manifests will be different at different levels of growth, which is represented by viewing the personality Enneagram as a 3-dimensional cylinder. So to connect this to Assagioli's egg diagram that I've been talking about, the dysfunctional levels, and there are several dysfunctional levels described, not only are we beginning to, in the dysfunctional levels, they're the result of unresolved issues in the lower unconscious. And at the average level, or levels, it's the middle unconscious and the conscious self that are dominant. And at the higher levels, not only are we beginning to connect with and make more conscious the resources of the higher unconscious, we are also more aware of and dealing with the contents of the lower unconscious. So in order to avoid either of these 2 kinds of bypassing, I would advocate integrating the modern personality Enneagram with the original and lesser known Process Enneagram. And this, I believe, is fully compatible with psychosynthesis. Now, there's a few basic facts that need to be understood about the Process Enneagram. First of all, involution, which is about developing an ego, and precedes evolution, developing a transpersonal sense of self. And I think this goes back to Jung, as far as I can remember. The second thing to stress is that there's nothing wrong with having an ego. We absolutely have to have it. You cannot have deny yourself if you haven't got a self to deny. But the only problem is when we identify with the ego as the true self. And then finally, each personality type has to undergo this cycle of growth in order to be the person they potentially can be. And therefore, we need to draw on the energies of all Enneagram numbers. Now, Gurdjieff taught that there were only 3 basic types of people: a moving center type, an emotional center type, and an intellectual center type. It's unfortunately he called these personalities when they're really just 3 functions, if you like, of who we are as human beings. And these essences, according to Gurdjieff, are a kind of DNA with which you're born. It's a pack of cards that you are dealt with as you start the game of life. It's a basic psychological and even biological temperament and predisposition. For Gurdjieff, the essence type is merely the starting point for the pathway of transformation that itself unfolds according to the law of 3. The essence is ploughed back into the interweaving and emerges at a whole new level as the real I. This is Cynthia Bourgeois, quoting Cynthia Bourgeois in the law of 3 and the Holy Trinity in the law of 3. Now, Gurdjieff used the analogy of a hackney carriage to explain what he meant by this. A person's body corresponds to the carriage itself. A person's feelings correspond to the horse, that is, all the horses that are harnessed to the carriage and is drawing it. And the coachman that is directing the horse corresponds to that which we call consciousness or thinking, our thinking self. And finally, the passenger seated in the carriage and commanding the coachman corresponds to that which is called I. Now, in the case of someone who is their true self, the passenger is the owner of the carriage. But for the person who's simply identified with this false ego self, the passenger is simply the person who hires the hackney carriage for a ride. Now, if the passenger is the pseudo self or ego personality, the 3 selves are not integrated, in which case the person functions like an automaton, just reacting unconsciously to the events of life, unaware of the contents of either the lower or the higher unconscious, and unaware of the contents of the other centers. So basically, they're all acting independently. And if he or she is the owner of the carriage, meaning the higher or true self, then all the three selves are functioning in harmony with each other, and each is fully aware of the other. But according to the Process Enneagram, we need to bring all three centers into our conscious awareness and learn to bring them into conscious relationship with each other. So thus, in the early stages of growth, the key practice is to learn to observe, really to observe one's bodily sensations and what they're telling you. And as one does this, one becomes more in tune with one's emotions. And then one has to learn to stay with the painful emotions, face the dark material of the lower unconscious. In the bottom of this Enneagram, Process Enneagram, where you go through between numbers 4 and 5, it's kind of the dark night of the soul, because it's a very difficult transition. And then only then are we beginning to we're ready to actually engage in spiritual practices that help us access the higher unconscious and the intelligence that it opens up for us. Now, to apply the whole cycle of the development to a human being, and to someone who embodies what we potentially can be, I offer the following illustration without being able to say very much about it in detail. But you'll notice these developmental stages are similar to the levels of growth in spiritual and maybe psychological intelligence of Ken Wilber's books. He talks about integral spirituality and integral psychology. And of course, the progress around the cycle is never straightforward, and that's what the arrow lines linking the numbers 1, 4, 2, 8, 5, 7 are all about. And under stress, it's possible, we must remember, to regress back to behaviors associated with an earlier stage. And neither does the stage reach correlate with the person's age. In fact, Ken Wilber reckons that the vast majority of humanity has not progressed much beyond the ethnocentric level of development, at which stage there's a strong tendency to identify with the group, be it ethnic, cultural, or ideological, or religious, to which one belongs. And so you've got a black and white, us and them situation, which is why we get all the conflicts that we have in the world, because everybody's looking after number one without realizing that we're all interconnected anyway. Now, the 3, 6, and 9 points in the Process Enneagram represent particular hazard points or sticking points in the process at which some external input or energy is required to keep one on course. Now, again, I'm not going to go into details of this because it can be applied, as I've said, to all kinds of other developmental cycles apart from the whole life cycle I've got on this particular diagram. But you can see here the hazard points, the sticking points, the adolescence, and we all know the difficulties of transitioning from a child into an adult or through that difficult time with what I've called a mixed up mind. And the other hazard point, which people are quite recognize, is this idea of midlife crisis, the challenged mind, when all our preconceived certainties suddenly are challenged and we suddenly have to open up to a completely different way of seeing the world. It's only then that we begin to be open to and be far more inclusive as a person and begin to function with a non-dual mind, and then on into the integrated mind. And the fully integrated person with what I call the no-self mind, which is a Buddhist concept, which doesn't mean to say you have no self, but it means that you are not identified at all with the ego self. Now, 3, 6, and 9 also, and this is in my concluding slide here, also the 3, 6, and 9 are also about the law of 3 in the Personality Enneagram and how it can be applied. So with the Personality Enneagram. And this is illustrated in this following diagram, which again, I'm just going to put up there for you to realize that there are 3 fundamental core works that everybody has to do although they are the core works of the 3, the 6, and the 9, you don't have to be one of these particular Enneagram types. All Enneagram types have to do it. And this, therefore, ties together the Process Enneagram and the Personality Enneagram. Because in the Process Enneagram, the first thing we have to do is to learn to self-observe and disidentify with the ego image. So this, therefore, results in the ego becoming the passive force, which I've talked about in the Law of 3, rather than the active force. And it's helped by things like conducting a daily review of consciousness, or in the Ignatian spirituality, it's the practice of the examine, and journaling is another way of doing it. However you do that, and of course it's not just when you do it in particular times of meditation or contemplation, but actually throughout the day, being aware. But then when we get to number 6 and in the Process Enneagram, that was the second hazard point. And this is what Gurdjieff calls his conscious suffering. Conscious suffering is the core work of the 6. Therefore, at the 6th point, you have to have courage. Now, the danger for 6 is a lack of courage. It's and they need to develop courage to compassionately face the fear that they feel, which is the core emotion of the 6 and of all the head types, actually, as a result of letting go of the ego defense mechanisms as they surface from the unconsciousness, which is what's going to happen as a result of the previous disidentifying with the ego image through self-observation. And this is where, particularly, I think the help of meeting with a compassionate therapist, somebody maybe who understands the Enneagram particularly, also helps. But then finally, we need to bring on board that third force. And it does, in a sense, although I've got this as a stage, it can happen. It needs to happen all the time, actually, because the earlier you can learn to relax the ego and to rest in grace, which through practices that connect you to that vibrant sense of grounded presence, the better. And so we have to learn to be actively engaged in the present moment through effortless effort, which is a lovely phrase, I think, coming from the Eastern traditions of spirituality. But this is the core work of the 9, because the 9s tend to disengage with the present moment for various reasons, which I won't go into. So this is to tie it all together and to relate it to the Process Enneagram and the Personality Enneagram. So I'm going to finish the sharing at that and close the video, finish the video. I hope you found it useful.